Thank you very much. First of all, I want to apologize for having to speak to you in English rather than Latvian. I am very proud of my Latvian heritage, but I can blame my father for not hammering Latvian into my poor skull when I was younger. So forgive me. Right, war on journalism. I'm not sure how many of you know my story, but let me just go back a little bit and tell you about what was happening at the end of 2013 when I went to Egypt. I've been working as a journalist across Africa for Al Jazeera, and I went only to Egypt for a couple of weeks to cover the political crisis that was taking place over the Christmas-New Year period. I was only filling in, and I didn't really know much about how the story worked. Now, I've worked in plenty of places before around the world in a lot of environments that are very dangerous. And I've pushed the boundaries. As a journalist, when you work in a particular story for a while, you start to get a sense of just how far you can push things before you upset the authorities. But in Egypt, I didn't know where those boundaries lay. So I wasn't pushing things. I was playing with a very straight, what we call a straight bat. Vanilla journalism. The opposition, the government would make a statement, a change something about the constitution perhaps. We'd pick up the telephone and call the opposition, and then find an analyst to make sense of it all. Very basic journalism. But it just so happens that at the time, the opposition was the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, they had been in power up until 6 months previously. They, in fact, won the first democratic elections in Egypt's history. And so they remained the biggest and most potent political force that Egypt had ever had. And so it made sense to speak to them. You know, as journalists, we have a responsibility to speak to all parties to a particular conflict. And so we were doing our jobs. It was basic journalism. So on the night of December 28th, I was getting ready to go out for dinner with some friends, with a friend of mine who I hadn't seen for some time, wasn't expecting anything, and there was a knock on the door. I didn't think anything of it. I put my clothes on, did up my shirt, answered the door. It was a lot louder, a lot more aggressive. And as I opened the door, it flung open as if there was a spring behind it, and the room was filled with about 8 or 10 guys, very big, large, heavy-set guys, and they pushed me to the back of the room. They went through the room, they grabbed my notebooks, my cameras, my computer, all of my equipment, and dragged me off down to a police station. Now, in the course of my work, I've been detained before. I've been through these sorts of things. I know how this works. The authorities arrest a journalist. They want to send a message to others. They want to make it clear that you need to be put in your place. But normally what happens is that after a few hours, there are some phone calls. Al Jazeera was very well connected, of course. And after a few hours, you'd be released, sometimes with an apology at the very worst. I'd have to spend 1 or 2 nights in the prison cells, and then I'd be sent off, perhaps sent to the airport and kicked out of the country, and that would be the end of it. Until I was sent to the interrogators. And we were sent down to a place called the National Intelligence Directorate. This is the place at the center of the spy operation, the domestic spy agency. And these guys are very serious. When I was sent in front of our interrogator, I was told, here is what you are accused of. We're charging you with aiding and abetting a terrorist organization, being members of a terrorist organization, financing a terrorist organization, broadcasting false news with intent to undermine national security. And when you think about it, these charges are about as serious as you could possibly get, short of actually throwing a grenade into the middle of a crowd or pulling the trigger on a Kalashnikov. These charges carry sentences of many, many years. Now, I struggled to make sense of this. I couldn't understand how it was that somebody had taken the evidence of what we had been doing, the facts of what we had been doing, which was very basic journalism, and somehow come to the conclusion that we were terrorists. It made no sense to me. One of my colleagues in prison was a wonderful character called Allah Abdel Fattah, a remarkable man, an Egyptian who was behind, one of the leading figures behind the January 25th revolution of 2011, the one that really started the Arab Spring in Egypt. Brought millions of people onto the streets and brought down the dictatorship of Hosni Mubarak. And he said to me that you need to understand the politics of this. You need to think about the politics. You need to remove yourself from the equation. Now, a lot of people have said that perhaps this was about Al Jazeera's relationship, or the Qatari relationship with Egypt. Qatar, of course, finances Al Jazeera, and the Egyptians have long accused Qatar of interfering in Egypt's internal affairs, of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, of supporting terrorism. But if that were the case, why come after me, an Australian, and my two colleagues who are Egyptians? It made no sense. Equally, they said, well, perhaps it was to do with your relationship to Egypt. To Al Jazeera, because again, Al Jazeera had been accused of colluding with the Brotherhood. But why would you arrest an Australian who'd only been in the country for 2 weeks and who had no serious connections with the Brotherhood? There were plenty of others with deeper connections than I. So I really struggled to make sense of this. Until there was one day when I was taken down into the dungeon, the basement, the holding cell in the base of the National Intelligence Directorate. And you're thrown down there, and when your interrogator is ready to speak to you, he sends someone down and takes you up. And this guy came down, he called my name, he put his handcuffs on me, and he's leading me up to speak to my interrogator. And as he's leading me up, he turns and he says, "So, where are you from?" And I said, "Oh, mate, I'm from Australia." And he goes, "Ah, Australia! Welcome in Egypt." "Thanks, mate. Really looking forward to visiting the pyramids sometime." But it made me realize that this wasn't personal. This wasn't about me. It wasn't about anything that I had done. But it was about what I had come to represent, and that was freedom of the press. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that, in fact, what was happening to me in Egypt was just a small example of a much wider problem that we're seeing around the world. That governments around the world are using national security as an excuse to silence the press. Now, I used to work in Afghanistan in 1995, and in 1995 we used to cross the front lines with Impunity all the time to go and speak to all sides in the conflict. And those days, the other side just happened to be a group that was emerging called the Taliban. Now, of course, these days that would be unthinkable, but at the time, the Taliban, they didn't necessarily like our politics or our theology, but they understood and recognized that we had a role to play because we were observers to the conflict. We weren't participants. We were there to watch and record. And that's how it was for so many conflicts that were over tangible things like land or water or ethnicity or political power, the kinds of things you could put your finger on. But after 9/11, things changed, and what we saw was George W. Bush stand in front of the joint session of Congress, and he said, "In this war on terror, you're either with us or you are with the terrorists." He made it a binary choice. You're on one side or the other. Now, this is not an abstract idea. He turned the war of things, it became, what we saw was that the nature of war changed from a war over tangible things to a war over ideas. And in that war for ideas, the place where journalists operate becomes, by definition, the battlefield, the media. Now, I realize that there are a lot of technological changes that have helped drive this, but what we've seen are some very serious consequences as a result of this war on terror, because I think the way that governments are prosecuting it tells us a lot about what's going on. So I'm now an academic, and as academics, I've learned that you can't ever give a lecture unless you have a PowerPoint presentation. So now I'm putting on my academics hat. So what's going on here? Well, let's have a look at the way that press freedom has changed over the years. In 1995, Freedom House has been doing this survey of press freedom around the world. And in 1995, this is the state of press freedom as it saw it. The green areas are those areas which are considered to be free. The yellow areas are those areas which are partly free. And the purple areas are those areas which have a press that is not free. And you'll see that the purple area extend all the way through Asia, the Middle East and North Africa. But generally it's not looking too bad. There's those areas of East Africa there which are partly free. Southern Africa is free, and most of Latin America is green as well. Let's see how things were 5 years on from there, 2000, and you'll see all of those green areas in Latin America and Africa have disappeared, and the purple areas have advanced. By the way, you'll see Latvia and the Baltic states are up there as green, free press. 2005, a little bit of a fight back in South America, but generally speaking, we also see the purple areas spread even further. 2010, it starts to we lose those green areas once again. In Africa, Latin America is completely gone. It's now partly free. And the not free areas, you'll see Asia is extended right across Asia. And finally, 2015 rather, we see things even worse. The purple areas extend even further. Freedom House says that, in its latest report, says the state of the world's press freedom is the worst it's been this century. This is a similar graph from the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, and it calculates the numbers of attacks on the press. Those grey areas are the numbers of journalists who've been in prison. The red blobs are for journalists who've been killed. And as you'll see, the broad pattern matches what we saw from those earlier graphs. So what's going on? How do we understand this? How do we explain this? Well, there are a couple of more graphs that I think will help us understand that. And that's this one. This is the number of journalists who've been killed since the CPJ started keeping records in 1992. And you'll see the numbers have dipped and changed. The numbers have gone down a little bit over the years. Oops, I'll come to that in a minute. The numbers are now about 43, 45 over the last couple of years. They're down from their highs. There are a number of reasons for this, although this year we're still on track for some very high numbers. But it's the broad shape that I wanted to draw your attention to. The early 1990s, we saw the peak. We see those peaks when we had the wars in Rwanda and Yugoslavia. Then the numbers dipped down through the late 1990s for a period that we now consider to be a bit of a golden age for journalism. And then they started to surge in 2004. You see those numbers peak. And then up until 2007, 2008, when they hit 75. These numbers are also, by the way, a very conservative definition of journalists because they don't include bloggers and media workers more broadly. And we see consistently the numbers up around, when you look at the numbers, generally around 70 to 80, sometimes up over 100. This is the number of journalists who are in prison, and last year was a record. 262 journalists who were in prison last year. But the shape of the graph is broadly similar. The early 90s, we see this peak here, we see the trough through the late 90s, early 2000s, and then they start to rise steadily. The turning point, I think, was 2001, 2002, when we saw the war on terror begin. And George W. Bush, I'm not blaming him for this because I think that he enabled it, but politicians around the world and the belligerents, the extremists, have both come to recognize the media as hostile to their goals. There's one more graph that I think is important to understand this, and that's this one. Journalists jailed, the charges that they were on. This graph here, oops, what's going on? This section here, this quadrant here, is for no other charges or no charge. What that means, that's those sectors which, those journalists that are on charges that you might normally expect journalists to be on, like defamation or slander, that sort of thing, journalistic crimes. But this massive chunk here, three-quarters, all this section here, those are journalists who are on what the CPJ calls anti-state charges. Treason, sedition, terrorism. Think about that. Journalists are in prison not because of the reporting that they've done, but because they're accused of violating national security laws. And this is the key point. What governments are doing is using national security to silence the press, to limit the space that journalists are able to operate in. The Egyptians said that we have guarantees of press freedom in our Constitution. We don't imprison journalists. These guys aren't journalists. They're terrorists. There were two journalists that were recently imprisoned in Myanmar for exposing a mass murder of some Rohingya refugees. The journalists managed to identify members of the military that were responsible for the murder, and those men went to prison for it. But the journalists were also arrested. They were handed in a setup, what now seems clearly a setup operation. The police called them to a meeting, gave them some documents that they said were related to the case, and then immediately arrested them for handling classified documents in breach of the Official Secrets Act. The journalists were prosecuted and convicted of breaching the Official Secrets Act, and guess what? They were sentenced to longer terms of prison than the men who actually carried out the murders. Aung San Suu Kyi said, well, look, these guys aren't journalists. They're not there for their journalism, they're there because they violated the Official Secrets Act. Turkey is the world's greatest jailer of journalists. Almost all of those guys are in prison on terrorism charges. Even the United States has been using national security laws to silence the press. I'm a big fan of Barack Obama. He was a great supporter of ours, but he also used the Espionage Act more than twice as often as all of his predecessors combined. And in almost every case, it was to go after journalists or their sources, not because they were revealing state secrets, national security secrets, but because they were exposing information that was damaging or that was politically embarrassing. We have something similar in Australia at the moment as well, where national security is being used to silence the press, to close the space that journalists are able to operate in. Now, I recognise that this is a problem. I recognise that governments are concerned about national security. But think about this for a moment. What we consider to be good journalism is a part of the way democracy is supposed to work. We are supposed to be the fourth estate, alongside the executive, the legislature, and finally, the judiciary. It's like a table with four legs, but if you knock out one leg, the whole thing becomes unstable. The media, good media, when it's working well, is the means by which we keep governments accountable. So what we need to do is protect the space that journalists are able to operate in. There is an organisation that has been talking about the grey zone. Now, by the grey zone, what they mean is this space that allows us, in a democracy, in a free society, to have disagreements without fighting. It's the space that is essential for a press to operate in. It's the space that allows us to have people of different faiths, different ethnicities living alongside us, and we don't break down into civil war. The grey zone is absolutely fundamental to a democracy. And the organisation that uses that term is an organisation, isn't an academic institution, a think tank, a pro-democracy group. It's not Amnesty International or Freedom House for that matter. It is Islamic State. They have an online magazine, and a few years ago they published a cover story in this magazine that's called Dabiq, and the cover story said, "The extinction of the grey zone," because Islamic State has made it its mission to wipe out that capacity for us to live in a pluralist, open, free society where we're able to have debates, where we're able to have conversations. Now, I know that there is a lot that the press has to do to regain public trust. I know that politicians would love to squeeze the space that we're able to operate in. But this is the way the system has worked for several hundred years, and we know that if we reduce the space that journalists are able to operate in, if we keep using national security as an excuse for locking up journalists, then we are going to be in real trouble. Today, ladies and gentlemen, is the International Day for Ending Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. 9 out of 10 murders of journalists go unsolved. 90%. That's because the authorities either don't care or are complicit in their murders. There were 3 journalists that were murdered in Europe in the past 12 months. In each case, they were investing corruption at an official level. We need to push back. We need to defend the space that journalists work. Us journalists need to lift our games. But there is a fantastic French philosopher, Albert Camus, who once said that a free press can, of course, be both good and bad, but a press that is not free can never be anything but bad. Thank you.